Welcome everybody. I'm just going to share my screen for a tiny bit, but welcome everyone. It's so nice to have you all. We have 41 participants so far and growing, a couple of minutes after 6. I will be your host and moderator. My name is Hussam Al-Jabri from the Muslim American Society. We are very blessed to partner at 3 congregations, people of faith, to come together in order to answer some fundamental questions about faith and to help our entire community kind of attach to God and know how we can help each other and how we can better understand our faith, better understand God, better lean into our spiritual being during this time of crisis. We have 3 distinguished guests with us who will each will be sharing some remarks, and then we're going to be open for QA. Rabbi Mike and Reverend Jill and Imam Khalil, and we'll introduce them before they speak. These are just some kind of housekeeping elements. Keep yourself muted so that we don't hear background noise. If the numbers stay at 40, we can probably, people can just speak their questions at the end, or you can raise your hand to ask a question. And you can also leave any comment or question on the chat, and we will get to them at the end. With that, I am honored to introduce Reverend Jill, who currently serves as the Harvard Unitarian Universalist Church in Harvard, Massachusetts. And she will be sharing with us a few remarks, and then we will move from there. Reverend Jill.
Thank you, Hussam. So grateful to be here with you all. I know that each of us come here tonight with our own unique mix of heartache and uncertainty, fear, confusion, loss, and for me, great sadness. And I'm grateful to Sarah and Hussam for inviting us into conversation so that we may find sources of strength and perseverance and hope together. So as you know, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and as it's a faith we experience as a living tradition, one that grows and evolves as our learning and reflection honors the lessons of the day. And Unitarian Universalism descends from Protestant Christianity, and we still do honor the spiritual depth and wisdom of the Christian tradition. But today we are multi-faith, and we draw wisdom from 6 different sources in our worship and our spiritual practices. So one question I'm asking as a person of faith in this crisis is, what's being asked of me in this time? And another question is, how can our faith communities together meet the needs of this day? Now, at the heart of both questions is a quality of relationship with the Most Holy. And each of our traditions offer a unique frame, or in the case of my tradition, several frames for the cultivation of this relationship. And common to all of us, I'm guessing, is this desire for this relationship with the Holy to guide and give meaning during this time. So my go-to person when it comes to my relationship with the Holy is Rabbi Heschel, a scholar and activist of beloved memory. My seminary shared campuses with Hebrew College, where I learned about Heschel, and I still hear his voice in times of need. He said once that without holiness, we sink into a state of wild unreasonableness, a state of absurdity, a condition that he knew personally as he fled the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940, just before the Nazis destroyed his people, his community, and his culture, so essential to who he was. So today, many essential parts of our lives are also threatened. Our jobs, our health, our schooling, our ability to pay rent and mortgage, to buy food, to be together and find meaning in the communities we cherish. So we are living in a time that feels wildly unreasonable. Back in his day, Heschel turned to his relationship with the Holy to sustain him, and many in the Western world turned to his teachings to make sense of the absurdity of the world then. A rabbi friend of mine recently sent me a link to a YouTube video in which Carl Stern, an NBC talk show host, asked Heschel shortly before he died in 1972, "Where is the holy to be found? The Bible?" And Heschel said, "No, no one person, book, religion, or culture has a monopoly on the holy." To paraphrase, he said that the holy exists in the potentiality born when we simultaneously hold two profound experiences. First, the experience of an abiding love, for him, the love of God. And second, the experience of humanity's great suffering. The holy emerges from the synergy of these two experiences, an emergence that brings both a rebuke of the harmful conditions and an unwavering hope that this abiding love will find in us a partner to respond with compassion and end the injustice. So holding human suffering and what we understand as the most holy simultaneously is not easy. Only the prophets do this well, but we can try. So the rabbis of long ago came up with a teaching to help us practice holding the holy and the suffering at the same time. A teaching you may know, it has gained currency in our popular culture. The teaching says that every person alive should carry two stones in our pocket all the time. The first stone to remind us that we are made of flesh and blood and bone. We live in bodies that get hurt and sick, and what happens to our bodies happens to us. There's no escaping that reality, that our time here is temporary and precious. And the second stone is to remind us that we are made in the image of the holy. We are more than our bodies. We are spirit and soul. Our bodies are the homes of this divine spark of life that each one of us carry. The second stone reminds us that we are eternal, whether that eternity comes from our spirit living on after we die or in the memories we leave behind. We are more than our bodies. We are mystery, holy, and sacred. Two stones, two realities. We are both. So when my colleague, Aaliyah Kemmler, shared this teaching in worship last Sunday, she talked about one stone representing our fear and the other our gratitude. And when the stone for fear feels really heavy, taking a deep breath and naming all that for which you are grateful is a practice of savoring so necessary to soften our anxieties in this time of overwhelm. But the two stones also teach us about our relationship with the holy, a relationship that gives us permission to be both uncertain and wise, vulnerable and strong, broken and magnificent. And holding these two opposing realities with tenderness and compassion, we catch glimpses of our profound interdependence. We know that what happens to one happens to all. We know that what happens to humanity happens as well to God, that we are not alone in this. At the grocery store yesterday, the woman ahead of me paid for a man's groceries when his debit card was declined, and he was frantically making calls to find money. And a small group of millennial leaders in Boston are mobilizing action on behalf of the working poor, the incarcerated, and those being displaced from their homes. They gained workplace protection for public workers before the shutdown, a partial suspension of evictions, and raised $12,000 in support of needy families in just 2 weeks. Brokenness and magnificent in the same moment. But living from a place that holds both takes practice. And without practice, we can easily slip into the survival of the fittest mode, a mode that diminishes the potentiality of the holy. Last week, as you know, 3.3 million people applied for unemployment insurance. This week, rent and mortgage is due. Half the people in this country live in poverty now, and 28 million are without access to healthcare during a pandemic. The magnitude of the inequity of our industrial growth economy and its master narrative of control and individual meritocracy is painfully evident in this crisis. So how does our magnificence make a claim on this brokenness to stand in solidarity with those suffering? So it has become increasingly clear to me that our growth economy narrative is crashing and that we need a new story. And as religious people, we have something to offer. Each of our traditions have experience in creating a new story when the old story crashed. From the fall of the Jewish temple in the year 70 AD, Rabbinic Judaism was born. As the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, fled from Mecca to Medina, Islam was born. And as my religious ancestors, the radicals of the Protestant Reformation, fled persecution in Europe, Unitarianism was born here in this country. And if we read our collective history, the players in these times of transition were small groups of people considered radicals then, who carried the essential seeds of the tradition forward. So to be a player in our new story, you need to do two things. First, you need to learn how to reshape your response to the world while deeply grounded in the values of your tradition, reaching out especially to the radicals who are more practiced in the art of crafting a new story. I often turn to the queer activists of color for insights, such as Detroit author and activist Adrienne Maree Brown, who reminds me that it is healing to look at something so broken and see the possibility and wholeness in it. Second, you need to listen to your intuition when it asks new things of you. Surprise is a quality of the holy. In our tradition, the 19th century transcendentalists, rebels in their day, remind me to look inward to find the answers to life's most perplexing problems. My favorite transcendentalist, abolitionist Theodore Parker said once, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is long and my eye reaches but a little way, but I can divine it by conscience, and I'm sure it bends towards justice." Words that live on in the legacies of both Gandhi and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and our collective Unitarian Universalist commitment to endeavoring holy agency and responsibility within the interdependent web of existence. So going forward, I pray that we emerge from this crisis in partnership with each other and the holy, engaged in a new story that centers justice and compassion. A story we will recognize when health and economic protection are extended to all as a defining quality of life. A story we will know with each shift from an extractive economy towards a regenerative one. Heschel said, "The more challenges a person or people struggle with, the greater the person, the greater the people. The holy is calling us to greatness." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jill, for this beautiful remarks. Really appreciated.
Sure.
And we will also now hear from Reverend Mike. Reverend Mike is leading the Beth Elohim congregation.
Rabbi.
Yes. And
nobody should revere me. That's you got enough problem.
Oh, Reverend, I'm sorry, Rabbi Mike. Yes, please, please, and I will put the bio here as well for others to see it. Please, Rabbi Mike, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, it's really an honor to be included with very powerful teachers, people who I admire for the spiritual paths that they open. So thank you for this honor of being included. I want to start, first of all, we say we're in a time of great loss of life. And the human life is in the image of God. And at a time of great loss, we say, Zichronam livracha, that the memory of those who have died should be for a blessing. And we're just, right now, we're walking around with the knowledge that there is the great consumption of human life that's happening. And that just has to hurt us. Even when we're trying to make our way through, and will I keep myself going through the day if I'm stuck inside? Can I share the living room with my partner? Are the kids okay? Are they going to run in the middle of the conference call? And do we have enough food to eat? And all of the things that we're all dealing with. This is all happening in the context of a loss of life. And so that's a real diminution of God and of the holy. And so again, I just want to raise up those lives who are losing at this very moment. The topic that we've settled on is faith and crisis. We are in a crisis, as I don't need to tell you. Faith is an interesting place to start. It's interesting for Jews because the Jewish community is, when we talk about communities of faith, Jewishness and Jewish community is not always a quote-unquote faith community. Now, why do I say that? Because there are some religious traditions where you start with a profession of faith, and that's your entree into that community. So if I believe this, then I'm part of the community. Jewishness is a community of identity as least as much as it is a community of belief. Of course, we have powerful beliefs, which I'll talk about in a second, or maybe a little more than a second. But there's a great thinker from the 20th century. I'm so glad that Reverend Jill mentioned Heschel. Abraham Joshua Heschel is one of my favorite teachers and real giant of the 20th century. Another Jewish giant of the last century was Mordechai Kaplan. And Rabbi Kaplan talked about Jewish civilization. So this is where I'm going. And he talked about a foundation going from the bottom up of belonging, behaving, and believing. That before even we have any kind of faith or belief in anything Jewish, that we belong. We belong to the community of Jews. That means that if you walk in the door here, if you're allowed to, right now we're not allowed to get together, but a Jew walks in and a Jew is a Jew. We don't say, well, what do you believe? Do you profess a particular faith? Excuse me. It's part of who you are. It's part of your ethnic identity, perhaps, or a communal or a family identity. We talk about mishpacha in Yiddish. It's the Yiddish version of mishpacha in Hebrew, family. And so that we've got that foundation of belonging. Then we have above that, Kaplan talks about behaving. What are the things that you do that make you Jewish? It could be that you keep the Sabbath. On Friday night and Saturday you don't work, or at least you restrict your work. Could be that you give tzedakah, you give money to the poor. Could be that you pay your workers on time, which is a Jewish obligation, and you don't oppress them. You build a sukkah during Sukkot, a hut to dwell in during the pilgrimage festival of Sukkot. Not every Jew does that, but they're still Jewish. And then at the top, you've got believing, right? So does every person who follows the mitzvot, do they believe in God? I don't know. We don't ask. They're there. So we're glad that they're there, right? Does everybody who gives tzedakah to the poor, do they do it because they believe in God? I don't know. We're glad that they help the poor because that's an obligation. So why do I kind of break this all down? Because we're in this moment where our faith is challenged and we're shaken up, but it might not be just faith in God. It could be faith in the community, because we're not allowed to be in community right now. We're at least not allowed to be in community physically. And we have to do stuff like this, and thank God we've got technology, but is the community going to be there for me? If I need something, if I'm grieving, right? Part of the Jewish community is if there's a loss, people go to each other's houses, right? God forbid, if I have a loss, people come to my house for Shiva, which is literally 7. It's the 7 days of sitting, and people come to you. People can't come to each other right now. People can't come together to celebrate a wedding right now. So is my community there for me? And then the behaving part is, do these actions matter? If I keep, Passover is coming up right now. So if I keep, I'm supposed to take all the leavening out of my house for Passover. So if I don't do it, does it matter anymore? And certainly, do I believe anymore? If I did. So this is not just shaking our spiritual connection, but it's all of the things that make us part of community. So I want to talk about, I probably have about 5 minutes left, I think. Is that right? Or did I've already talked too much?
No, we still have a few minutes.
Still have a few minutes, okay. So let's start in that baseline of belonging. With Passover coming up, again, we've talked about this being a community-based religious tradition. Passover is the celebration of a group of people, the Israelites, who are a group of immigrant workers, and they are low-wage workers. They are oppressed workers. Right? We talk about Passover as a liberation struggle for the Jewish people, but who are the Jewish people in Egypt? They are immigrant workers. They're what we would call guest workers now. They've come from someplace else. They've come because of economic need, because there's a famine in Canaan or Canaan, and here they are. And suddenly you've got a leader, you've got a pharaoh who says, we can exploit these people, we can take their labor, and once we've taken their labor, we can use them as political pawns to say, there's an other, and they're dangerous, and we better be smart about this, it says in Exodus, because we don't want to, they might take our stuff away. Let's get them. We're all part of religious community. It's really important that we trust community. Again, whatever you do religiously, whatever you believe, there are messages that come from Pharaoh that they reflect grotesque priorities. I'll just say that. Pharaoh in the book of Exodus is, he's trying to consolidate power. You've got now, I hope you don't mind me saying, and even if you do, we should talk about it. We seem to have a president who cares more about his TV ratings and his poll numbers than about the bodies that are piling up in our morgues. And sometimes our morgues are not big enough, and we have to make makeshift morgues. So the power of community, of us coming together and talking about this, to say, no, actually, hey, do you see me? Can I look you in the eye and say, the values that we're hearing from Pharaoh are not our values? Can we agree with each other on that? That's at least as powerful as any text we can read. So that's number one. Number two, so how do we act? We look at a world that treats people as expendable. We have laborers that we've treated as expendable, that we've said we can pay them less and less. And I think Reverend Jill was talking about, kind of a hoarding mentality in an economy that says, build up your profit margin and pay people as little as possible. Well, we find out that these people that we treated so badly, delivery drivers and pharmacy clerks and the people that work at the grocery store, suddenly we find out that they're essential, and that we wouldn't be able to live right now if it wasn't for the folks who make low wages working at Stop and Shop or working at whatever, at Trader Joe's or whatever it is. Can we start behaving, as Kaplan says, as if we value those people? Can we have a reorientation of our values? Can we start talking to each other and saying, hey, the way that we've organized this structure is just all wrong? Can we go to to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where it says, pay your workers on time and don't oppress them, because they'll cry out to God, and God will see it as a sin, not in us, not in the worker rather, but in us, because we set up a system like this. And can we see a possibility in a spiritual renewal? So if you are a believer in some way, is this a wake-up call to have our conceptions of God been very convenient? Well, I'm okay, I've been taken care of, I must be doing okay. Or can we actually say, hey, this is not all right. We've let this go on in a way that's not only degrades the people who are in a lower position in society, but degrades us by perpetuating a system in which we have unearned benefit. There's something in Judaism. Now, I don't know what your theology is. Again, Kaplan puts this as the last thing. In Hebrew, we call it mida keneged mida, measure for measure. Some people would call it karma. In Hebrew, it's mida keneged mida. This for this eventuality for this character trait. And we look at what's going on in the world right now. We're isolated. Well, who have we isolated? We've isolated ethnic minorities and people of color in ghettos for how many decades and hundreds of years. We have suspicion. I'm afraid of you. You might have a thing that I don't want to catch. We've been suspicious of immigrants and our Muslim cousins who are on this call. There's been suspicion against Jews. We have a lack of freedom of mobility. I can't go where I want to go. Well, we look at immigrants who have been afraid to walk out of their door because somebody might catch them at the RMV, at school, at a hospital. So if you believe in this kind of God, I don't know, this is intense, right? But if this is a mida keneged mida kind of thing, look at what we're sowing, the seeds that we've planted. I want to finish with the possibility that, like I said, this is shaking us up enough that we're going to start to think about how we connect to community, how we act in the world, what we believe about a God of justice and a God of connection and a God of radical love. Can we get there? Can this be the wake-up call? The tens of thousands of corpses that are piling up right now, which are a reflection of the degradation of God's image and an indictment for us that our priorities and our values are all out of whack. God, I wish it didn't take this, but if this is what it takes, let us at least find a way forward. Ken Yehi Ratzon, we say in Judaism and Hebrew, may it be God's will. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mike, for these words. Really appreciated. We have also with us Imam Khalil, who is the Muslim chaplain in Harvard University and a professor in the Harvard Divinity School. Imam Khalil, please.
Thank you, Hussam, and thank you everybody for peace and blessings. Be with all of you and all of your families, your loved ones, all of our neighbors, all of ours. We have, we've all been taken and are being taken and are still yet going to be taken through the crucible of significant change as a result of current events. And whenever we encounter trauma, loss of life, anything related to that, we have an expression in the Islamic tradition which goes like this: we belong, and to God turn. This expression finds its way in so many different parts of, the encounters that Muslims have with, whether it's end-of-life care, sound of a fire truck siren or an ambulance, or it's the presence of a funeral procession, or it's with a the news from a neighbor or a friend or someone we don't even know that they are struggling with life. So the recognition, number one, of a higher power, the recognition of the presence of the divine, the recognition that there are certain things that are beyond our control is part and parcel of how in the Islamic tradition we are taught that there is a certain level of weakness because we are human beings. There is a certain level of weakness and humility that we are meant to be reminded of. Despite that, we are still told and taught and reminded in the Islamic tradition that we are to be a people of courage. We are to be people of character, and we are to be people of creativity in the midst of daunting challenges. One of the things that we are reminded of, that we're taught, is that the sacred text, the Quran, teaches us, is that when we seek help in a circumstance, we're to seek help with two different means. One is prayer, and the other is perseverance, right? What I call P squared, prayer and perseverance. So prayer is this action of the body, and perseverance is the action of the mind and the spirit. The prayer is done in a physical space and is typically does not involve actual motion as it relates to walking or running or journeying. It involves bodily motion. Nonetheless, not a change from one physical space to another space. But perseverance does involve movement from one place psychologically, from one place emotionally, from one place spiritually to a different place. Perseverance implies that we are able to perceive and, dare I say, conceive the idea of light at the end of the tunnel. Otherwise, you wouldn't persevere. You wouldn't continue. So prayer, taking the moment in and acknowledging our, our ontological poverty, our weakness, that there are certain things we can't control. And therefore, we need to reach out and derive strength from a source outside of us. And some folks derive strength from different places. So, for example, there are most of the population strength from outside factors, whether it's community, right? That's why we have community gatherings. That's why those communal gatherings are so important for people. We find that people who have certain weaknesses to certain behavioral traits, for example, folks that are struggling to overcome alcohol addiction, for example, find strength in a community of folks like them that are struggling as well. Folks that are going through different kinds of mental health challenges find strength in other folks also that have a similar challenge, that are going through those things. So oftentimes it's part and parcel of our characteristic that we seek to supplement weaknesses with the strengths of everybody else, or the strengths outside of us that we find in people and community, in stories and narratives, and sometimes in even pictures. But what happens when those things are taken away from us? What happens when we're in times like this, when we don't have the ability to physically draw close to somebody else, or even to hear those narratives verbally or directly, shall I say? Everything is indirectly transferred to us. We are reminded that we have to draw strength from a presence, at least from the Islamic tradition. We're taught to draw strength constantly from a presence that is with us no matter what. But sometimes through our routines, we tend to forget this ultimate higher presence that's with us no matter what. So seeking support and help in being courageous about the fact that the future is going to be better than the present, even if the steps towards that future get a little bit darker and darker and darker, keeping in mind that the night is always darkest is very important in this. And in the Islamic tradition, we are taught to have faith and hope and courage in the future. There's a really nice narrative that I'd like to remind myself of and share with all of you from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, where he says, live for tomorrow as though you'll live forever, but live for today as though you'll die tomorrow, right? So the idea is that, as though, your planning for tomorrow involves the fact that you perceive the fact that you have hopes and dreams and plans, execute those things. But you're going to keep in mind that today there's a possibility that tomorrow may not come. So there's a balance between living life in its proper sense, in its fullest sense, but also with the reminder that, as I articulated before, to God we belong and to God we shall return. And so in the midst of negotiating between today and tomorrow, between living life to its fullest and having hopes and dreams, and also encountering the end of life, in the midst of that and in between that, what are some things for us to do to keep us balanced? Well, there are two things that I'd like to share with you, and then I will defer back to the moderator. The first is that we are constantly, as human beings, we're in the constant for stability. And one of the things that crisis does is that it introduces change to us. And change is very difficult for us to handle. Change uproots us. Change introduces us to frictions and to novelties that make us uncomfortable, because we find comfort in stability. We find comfort in routine. Change alters that. And so even for all of us that have to stay home, the change which involves not going out is still traumatic, even though we're in our homes. We're not, most people are not quarantined, for example, or self-isolating, for example, or in the waiting lounge or, of an airport. Most of us are at home, but the fact that our routine has changed and we become isolated from not only people, but more importantly, our routine, those places, the same faces that we've grown accustomed to. That has been destabilizing for us. It's de-anchored us from the world, and we are searching for a sense of rootedness, a sense of being stable. We are searching for anchoring, and the Islamic tradition through the sacred text teaches us that in moments like this, in moments where we are destabilized and we are plucked from our norms, how do we navigate territories? Well, we find anchoring in the one thing that does not change, and we are taught that we are to search for the act to latching on to the divine through prayer, through acts of giving as well. We'll talk about giving in just a second, but latching on in hope and recalling, reaching out to God for help is that act which anchors us, because we are taught in the Islamic tradition that God doesn't change, that God is stable, for example. And so we persevere, we get the strength through remembering the blessings that we have. When we start to count our blessings, we remind ourselves of the gifts that we have been given, despite the challenges that we have. We remind ourselves that there is still a sense of normalcy, that there is still great benefits and great blessings that we have in our midst, that because those blessings are there, that is part of the evidence of the fact that we've not been forgotten about, that we still have things in our midst that help us, sustain us, take care of us, and give us comfort, and that we still have something to hold on to. So any trial and tribulation that we encounter, the fact that it could be worse, and it's not worse, but the fact that it could be worse is still cause in the Islamic tradition to show gratitude, to be grateful, to remind oneself of the presence of God, and also cause for us to exhibit conduct that is befitting of somebody who's showing gratitude. This means to help others. So this is the last part, is that our blessings that are in our midst, we must also think about those who have who are less fortunate than we are, and do what we can in our midst to try to make the world for them a better place. So the Muslims in the Islamic tradition are really tasked with trying to find creative ways to connect to the divine and remember God in crisis by and through connecting and helping people improve their lot. I mean, in another way, put another way, we are told in a text that all of creation, everything in the world, are dependents of the divine. Right? We normally think of dependence in the tax sense, right? But we are taught in the Islamic tradition that everything in the creation are dependents of the divine. And then the text says, and the most beloved of the dependents to God is the one that serves and benefits other dependents. So we are taught that it's not just about a sort of a selfish, although when we're in a crisis, we think about ourselves and we turn to the divine. We're taught to turn to the divine, but there's a condition, there's a caveat. You can only connect to the divine only as much as you're able to make the life of another person better. So charitable giving is supposed to be increased in this time. The worse of the crisis you're in, the more creative ways of charitable giving you're supposed to find. The more of a crisis you're in, the more active you're supposed to be in reaching out to your neighbor. On the contrary, the paradox of self-isolation in the context we're in is an opportunity, at least in the Islam, to get creative about new patterns and avenues and doors and windows of discoveries for opportunities for how we can come together, because social distancing better not, ever not mean social isolation. And so this is sort of the navigation that we are charged to do in the Islamic tradition. Hold fast to what is stable, pursue or cultivate your sense of being, your presence, your knowledge, your awareness of God, your prayer, but you've also got to persevere through the world. And in order to persevere through the world, you've got to leave the places and traces of your presence behind, because just like a virus is contagious, there are also positive contagions out there. So in order to combat the negative contagion, you as a human being, me, all of us are charged of the Islamic tradition to spread positive contagions, even in the most dire times that we are in. And I'll just stop right there. Hope I've not taken up too much time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Imam Khalil, and thank you, Rabbi Mike and Reverend Jill. Very, I think a lot to just consume and to kind of put in our head, all of it for the purpose of giving us ideas on how we can connect our spiritual self in this time of crisis, how to better understand God, and how to learn more about what He wants from us at this time. So maybe at that, we'll open it for questions, and you can, let's just start to see how many have questions. I already have a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll start with these, and you can also kind of raise your hand on the screen, and we will go ahead and unmute you. So the first question is, in your tradition, what do you believe God wants from us? How does He expect us to act in these times? What does your tradition say the benefit of hard times? So we'll open it to the panelists, and they can all take, each one take it, or each one choose, and then we'll keep going with other ones.
Well, I can start. I mean, I think we'll probably have different answers. We're not all theists in Unitarian Universalism, so what is God asking of us? I'm going to translate a little bit to one of the core values, that the presence of the divine, or when that's really what the core values that we embody. is dignity, or that we aspire to embody. So, and it's what unites us. Like we are all we all have dignity, you know. It's like we're born with dignity. And so getting to a place in our relationships with each other, and with the holy, is just being creative on how many ways that we can reaffirm, reestablish, affirm the dignity of our fellow human beings. And that, you know, I think grieving every one of these deaths is important. That brings dignity to all of us. I think that, you know, bringing a liberation theology lens to this crisis, in which, you know, I loved what Rabbi Michael said about the value of the workers. You know, that we're all of a sudden seeing the value of these workers that we have not really treated with dignity. So it's restoring those kind of broken relationships. And so that's what the holy is calling us to do and be. And I think, you know, I love the Imam, what you talked about, the role of prayer is something also, a way of accessing probably power and strength that we aren't used to accessing, you know, in terms of our own sense of agency. And I think because the crisis is so different and does invite so much change, that we are all in some way put into this place of asking, and it's just going to bring us to our knees in some way. And that sense of humility and presence of knowing our limits, yes, and also recognizing our abilities to help. It's just this really rich mix. And this time separate but together in this way is a way to name all these things. And I think we just have to be creative in our ways of writing it, of praying it, of speaking it, of texting it, and just being present to each other in so many different ways than we're used to.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jill. I welcome also input from our other esteemed speakers, and also want to say that if people want to comment on the chat, kind of your own answer, or how you've kind of interpreted that question to yourself, that can also be a way for us to communicate. But Rabbi Mike or Imam Khalil, if you have anything to share on that.
Well, I'll have great admiration for Hoda, who I think put 4 questions into one question, which is very impressive. I'm sure the 3 of us could all give a long answer to each one of those questions. I'll try and be brief. What does God expect from us? It's interesting. There's a story in the very beginning. The first Jewish man is Abraham, the very beginning of the Torah. And Abraham finds out that God is going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, because they are filled with just real cruelty to each other, to folks, to immigrants, to the poor. And God's like, oh boy, I'm going to just start over. This crew they're just not salvageable. And Abraham doesn't know anybody there. The only person he knows there is Lot, who is his nephew. Abraham could say, God, let's get Lot out of there before you destroy everybody. But Abraham doesn't. Abraham argues with God. What about the innocent people that are there? You can't, okay, if you have to punish them, what about the innocent people who are in the town? This is not the way that a righteous God acts. And God has a soliloquy, which is, I think it might be the only soliloquy in the Torah, maybe in the Bible, I don't know. When God is trying to decide whether Abraham should know about this dastardly plan of wiping out Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, should I tell Abraham what I'm going to do? You know, Abraham is supposed to have this whole tradition, this family, we talked about family, this community that comes after him. And their job is going to be to follow Derech Adonai. It's what it says in Genesis 18, the path of God. And what's the path of God? Well, God tells us what's the path of God. La'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, to do justice and righteousness. It's right there, Genesis 18, the first Hebrew, the first Jewish guy, God says, here's your mission statement: do justice and righteousness. It's pretty clear. So how does God expect us to act? God expects us to act with justice and righteousness, like the Imam was saying, to step up our giving and our sharing. Tzedakah, also the word for helping the poor in Hebrew, related to tzedek, related to justice. I'm not giving because I'm such a nice person and your story has moved me, and so on the TV it made me cry. No, I give because I have too much if you have too little. That's an imbalance of economic power. So I'm expected to say, oh, something bad is happening. I can balance it by doing fairness, and I can balance it by doing righteousness. That benefit, I don't think hard times have a benefit. Benefit is, we don't want to glorify this. This is a crisis. This is a catastrophe. What it can do is invite us to, like I said, to rethink our where we've been and who we've set ourselves up as a society. To pick up on prayer, which I think all three of us have talked about. Can I share a screen? I'm going to see if I can do that. See
you
what
should
happens.
be able to, yeah.
Let's see. So I invite you to look at the Psalms. The Psalms are these really powerful expressions of all sorts of emotions: joy and sadness and anger. And the anger is something that some of us are afraid to get in touch with. Psalm 44, for instance, is people, the Jewish people, angry with God, saying, we didn't do anything wrong. We haven't been, this is the other side, right? Okay, on the one hand, how can my behavior change? But on the other hand, I'm really upset. We didn't forget the name of God. We didn't pray to a foreign God, to an El Zar. God would know that because God knows our thoughts. But we're killed all day. We're like sheep to the slaughter. You know that phrase. And then it says, Ura, get up. The psalmist says to God, Lama Tishan, why are you sleeping? Get up. Why are you hiding your face? Kuma, get up and help us. So as we look at our deeds and our social values and our personal values, I want us to also see that the psalmist gives us permission to be really ticked off, to be really angry and in deep soul anguish about what's happening. And if that's something that you have felt like you're not allowed to feel, let yourself feel that, and note that you're in a fine tradition of the psalmists who do the same thing. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think in answering, the questions, what does God want from us or expect of us in these times, and what does our tradition say about the benefit of hard times or challenging moment, crises, trauma, etc. I think what I could offer from the Islamic tradition first, a little narrative, and it's not a sacred text, but I think it's indicative of the way we would think about what the Islamic tradition would have to say. So there are famous narratives or stories about an old teacher in the Islamic tradition that teaches through humor or teaches through parables and really weird answers. The Arabs call this figure Joha, and the Turks call them Nesruddin. And so, this teacher, Joha, he's sitting with three students, and it's time for them to eat. And Joha pulls out, a rack of lamb, and the three students, they're so happy, they're delighted to have this wonderful meal. And Joha says, well, hold on for a second. Don't everybody serve their plate. I'll serve you. Do you want me to serve your plate? Do you want me to divide the lamb up according to the laws of human beings? Or do you want me to do it according to the laws of God? And the students say, oh, dear teacher, respected teacher, of course, what better division is there than the division of God, how God would do things, of course, So the teacher, Joha, takes a little bit of the lamb and puts it on one student's plate, and then takes the rest of the lamb and puts it on the second student's plate, and then leaves the third student with nothing. And so the third student that has nothing on their plate protests. So, teacher, this is not fair. You know, I didn't get anything. And the other teacher, you know, a little bit less, but as some this teacher, I'd like a little bit more. You know, this is, you know, you put a little bit on my plate. Could I have some more, please? And why does that other person, the other student, get more? And the student that's got a full plate is like, thank you so much. Oh, great teacher. You know, you're so generous. But then they look at each other's plates and it says, teacher, maybe I could share a little bit, and you want to redivide this? And the teacher says, well, you asked me to divide it according to the way the divine does things. Some to others and a lot to some, and none to, you know, he tests people and human beings in different ways and puts people in different circumstances, not because it's wrong, but to see what you're going to do about it. And so the Islamic tradition approaches circumstances like this in this way. There's a sacred text that says, the divine, that God is the one that introduced and that creates life and death, going to test you to see what acts will emerge from. So, you know, we encounter trying moments, and we are expected to rise above the occasion, even if the occasion drops us down to our knees. We're supposed to discover our fullest potential. But the paradox of the human condition is that we only can discover our fullest potential when we are tried, when we are tested, when we encounter difficulty, when we encounter that really are very difficult for us. At the same time, the text tells us in terms of how we are to derive meanings from this. At the same time, the sacred text tells us that no person on the planet will be tested with anything that is beyond what it to bear, right? Is that, you know, there will be elements of trials and great difficulties that emerge in our personal lives, in our communal lives, in our family lives, in our national life as a country, but we are inundated with difficult moments, but these difficult moments are not so difficult that they are insurmountable obstacles for us, but yet they're challenges that are meant to allow us to rise to our fullest potential, and we are to meet the challenge and to compete, as the text tells us, the sacred text tells us, to compete in acts of good. We do, unfortunately, we're inundated in times where, you know, there's been a lot of competition in acts that have not been for good, you know. But now that we've got a global pandemic, right, see that there's a competition for saving lives, right? There's a global competition for the redistribution of wealth. There's a global competition for trying to help those that are in need, both in rich countries and rich communities and those that are not. Because regardless of economic status, this kind of challenge, meaning the coronavirus, does not discriminate with borders and economic language and all the discussions and debates and all of these things, all of those discussions. I mean, you know, they don't. Highest walls in the world and the greatest security apparatus are not going to be the best defense against a virus. And so the way that we get through this is understanding that, you know, certain patterns of behavior that we have had as a community that are not that bring us to the point where we need to think about how to be better, how to rise to a different occasion. And so this is kind of what, you know, the tradition offers to us in a nutshell from the Islamic point of view, that, you know, when we see disparities and challenges, we encounter these things, we're supposed to, you know, we're dropped to our knees, not just in prayer, but we're supposed to understand that we've got to get up from our knees as well, and we've got to do something about it, and hopefully a place after the crisis than the way it was the crisis emerged.
Thank you very much, guys, for the beautiful answer. So there is a spirit of me of a TV host personality that is reawakening now. So allow me, I wasn't planning to do this, but I think I'm going to try to do this. And I want to hear from maybe a couple of folks on the forum just to kind of get people a little more engaged. I think there were a couple of elements that were kind of intriguing that kind of hit to the crux of the problem, which is, how do you deal as a person of faith from your tradition? How do you deal with when God does something that seems to be unjust, or that seems to be bad, or that seems to be not good? And maybe we'll get a couple of answers from folks on the call, and just to kind of share with us, and then we'll go back to some of the questions if you guys are okay with that. So if you'd like to speak, you can either unmute yourself or maybe raise your hand, and I will try to find a way to unmute you. Okay, someone, let me unmute. Go ahead, Huda.
Hello, everyone. So the question comes from a perspective that we're equal in knowledge, that God and I are equal in knowledge. And what I remind myself of is that our knowledge is very, very limited. And what we see is very, it's just our worldview, which is really limited. And there's a verse in the Quran that puts things in perspective for me, in which God says, and you may dislike a thing and it's good for you, and you may like a thing and it is bad for you, and God knows and you do not know. And I think that for us, that's a good reminder, because I guess we can all tell that there was a moment in our life, or many, many moments, in which we really wished for something, but later on we found out that actually it wasn't, thank God it didn't happen, or vice versa. So I'll stop here. So just one reflection.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Any others? Let's get a couple more people from different parts of, either raise your hand or unmute and speak.
Maybe Sam, you want to repeat the question just so people.
Yeah. So I think the question was, how do you handle the reality that sometimes something may happen that may seem to be unjust, and then you're asking, is God doing or causing something that is unjust? How do you, how do you handle it? Do you get angry? Do you put up with it? How do you handle it? Going once, twice. I'm gonna question my TV host personality now, but that's fine. So let's actually go to another question that was posed here from Laura. Thank you, Laura. How does one discuss this with younger children? My little girl says God is all loving, but cannot understand how people are getting sick and passing away. What is the teaching tool set for younger children?
Well, so I'll jump in and say, again, it's part of the, part of this is not God's doing. This is humans doing. That even if you believe God creates viruses, and you may or may not believe that, we had in our country, we had a leadership who wanted to keep a boat of sick people away from the country because it would, again, change the numbers, and he didn't want the numbers to go up, and then it's a hoax, and then we've made a big mistake. We've made a number of really big mistakes, and really again, we have mismatched priorities. I don't know how old the little girl is, but the little girl can know that sometimes people don't take care of each other, and that part of our job is to be partners with God and to do a better job of seeing that everybody has God inside of them. The other thing that I would say is that sometimes those kinds of questions or those kinds of responses are just an opportunity for kids to say, basically they're saying, is it okay grown up in my life to have these feelings? And if we say, yeah, tell me more about how you're feeling, sometimes that's the best answer, is to just say, you know, I'm sad or I'm confused. And to hold, you know, if this is a little girl in your house, it's safe to hold her and say, it's really sad, isn't it? And sometimes that's the best answer. We're not so smart to know the answer, as I think Hoda said, but just letting people feel what they feel and knowing that that's safe to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And possibly if she is a believer in God, just think, you know, to say that God's crying too, you know, and to recognize the presence of God in the people trying to help, you know, just to lift up. Like, I think at 7 o'clock tonight, we're supposed to put a candle outside in our window to recognize all the people, the helpers right now. So looking to the helpers and seeing the presence of God in the helpers.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And also, you know, with children, one of the things that really helps is to call their attention to things they don't see, that are not. So, you know, one of the, God, you know, when she encounters, or the child encounters people that are sick, or asks about sick people and whatnot, and they say, oh, you know, where's the love? And so, first of all, you know, a child can be taught to be able to perceive their different manifestations and different examples emerges, and certainly the way that the person is blessed. You know, so part of living this life is to be exposed to things that happen in this life. You know, the love of God, or the love of the divine, occurs in different ways. So the family that's there is one source of and manifestation of the divine. The fact that a person has access to medicine, the fact that the child themselves is concerned about the person is a sign and a manifestation of God's love. And so this, I think it's a great opportunity, Laura, to talk with your child about, one, the nature of the world, but there are things present in ways the child has not maybe perhaps thought about, because love is very abstract as well. And so love is not just present in the people, because we have examples of healthy people that do sick things with their decisions, with their time, with their money. And so, you know, just having a clean picture of health does not mean the action is healthy, and does not mean that that person is not, you know, a virus because of the decisions they make, you know, in the terms of, you know, legislation and etc. And so there are incredible ways that being in the presence of folks that have that apparently look like they have less than we do, and in many ways they can be recipients of incredible from the divine. People walking around are totally access to. I mean, I have sisters who are nurses in New York City and one in Atlanta, who are, you know, constantly, when, you know, they're in the presence of folks that are, you know, you see little beautiful examples and gems of the presence of the divine in different ways that are not readily visible in a circumstance, you know, if you're just talking to somebody on the street and whatnot. And so children can be taught to discover different ways to look and perceive love and blessings and good things, and that not everything is externally, right? That does not take away suffering or trauma. That does not take away from that in any sense, but it does mean to say that our perceptions of good are incomplete at best.
Thank you so much. Beautiful answers from our speakers. I'd like to crowdsource the question and see if people, you know, if you have a child, and many of us do, and they ask you that question, if somebody feels that they have a, you know, very specific or personal answer that would makes sense and they would like to share to help us out, would love to hear you. You can unmute yourself and speak, or raise your hand, or even write it on the chat. Anyone? They usually say, give 15 seconds and see if somebody will speak with the silence.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name's Lori, and I run an after-school program in Sudbury, and I also work for Rabbi Mike. But I think Reverend Jill there had touched briefly on a Mr. Rogers quote where he says, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You can always find people who are helping," which really is kind of goes hand in hand with the story Imam Khalil had just talked about with the lamb and the plates. And I think that was a great, excellent story, and I think that story in itself could be shared would be a great story to tell kids about, when bad things happen, one of the great things we can do is to help each other.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Lori.
There's also a comment in the chat from Jan M. Do you want me to read it?
Please.
Okay. I sometimes remind my children to be grateful for all the good things we have, not simply to avoid thinking of the painful things, but to be grateful and happy that today we are healthy. Today we have a lovely house. Today we have a great yard to play in. And today we have the internet to see friends. So yeah, I mean, that sense of mindfulness, staying in the present.
Beautiful, beautiful. Maybe we'll take one more comment. Anybody who would like to share how they would handle this? All right, so let's take maybe one more question. And yes, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Hassam. This is Ahmed Rashid. I'm sorry, I'm always very late when I try to unmute myself. So I apologize in advance that as soon as you said, okay, we're all set, I interrupt you.
No, go for it. That's fine.
So I want to talk about two things, both of them in response to the question about how do we explain this to our children. So actually, a few days ago, there was in our community conversation, there was a discussion. Brother Wa'il had introduced to us Surah Ar-Rahman, which is the chapter in the Quran that is the beneficent, one of the names of God, one of the names of Allah. And one of my reflections on that chapter is Ar-Rahman in the Arabic language doesn't just mean someone who is kind particularly to you or to him or to her. Ar-Rahman is the universal comprehensive mercy of our Creator towards each and every one of His creations. That we as human beings, we tend to be very selfish and we only look at it from our perspective without looking at what is the big picture. How do we fit in the balance of the rest of creation? On the one hand, it's very humbling to realize that there are other creations around you and that our share of the good times is balanced by the share of the other creatures or the other creations' good times as well. So that was one thing I just wanted to highlight, is that when we talk to our children, when I talk to my children about, what's going on, I say, it's not just about me. It's not just about you. It's not just about everyone. It's about everything. And one of the principal pillars of faith in Islam is the idea that there is a plan, there is a purpose, there is a wisdom, even if we can't comprehend it. That's the first part. The second part that again, more directly, how do we explain to our children the existence of suffering and evil and bad things happening to good people, right? It's a very classical philosophical question, the problem of evil. How can there be an all-benevolent creator when there's such pain and suffering in the world? And actually, in chapter 79 of the Quran, the first two verses actually answer that. When Allah says in the Quran, الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا, which means, glorified and blessed is He who created death and life so that He can test you which of you is the best in conduct. This really hits it on the hammer. This hammer really hits the nail on the head of realize what is the purpose of this worldly life. The Islamic perspective is that the whole point of this worldly life is to test us in good times and in bad times, and when we have a little and when we have a lot. And therefore, it's perfectly natural that there will be some people who get a lot of meat, some people who get a little bit of meat, and some people who get no meat. Because the whole point, as you know, as the story of Imam Khalil was, is the whole point is to see how is each recipient going to react and respond. So those are my that's my 10 cents.
Thank you, Ahmed, for your 20 cents. I really appreciate it. It's great. Wonderful. So maybe let's take one more question. If somebody actually wants to unmute themselves and ask.
I think Sarah Coletti was going to. Oh, there she is.
Sarah, please go ahead. Or Rabbi Mike, if you want to read. I haven't actually read it yet.
Just typed it into the comments, my question.
Well, you can read
Yeah,
it.
go ahead and say it.
Okay. One of the really tough things about this time is to know that people are dying alone, and people who are near death in nursing homes or in hospitals are alone. And those of us who love those people are separated from them. And I just wondered if there's anything in the faith traditions to help us understand this and to heal or to help in any way.
Yeah, Sarah, I think your question is very, very, very powerful and really important. And, you know, through the Islamic lens, you know, there are so many references to us of the fact that that there is a benefit, there is and a moral and a practical benefit to constantly reminding ourselves that not alone, that we are part of being always in the presence of the divine. And yes, physical people, physical individuals, their presence is very important, but it is also critical for loved ones in this time who have no choice but to be physically separated from their loved ones who are in nursing homes or in the hospitals, for example, to be comforted in the fact that this is also the meaning behind this phrase, you know, to God we shall return. That, you know, the presence of the divine, the presence of God is such that that presence is there whether people are there or not, whether resources are there or not. One of the most beautiful texts on what says that goes like this: when my creatures ask me, when my servants ask you, where am I? Tell them I am near. I respond actively to the one that calls on me. So call on me, and I will answer you, so that you may be directed to my way and to God, be guided in my way. So, of isolation, there's several examples in the text where we are charged with recollection and this awareness that, you know, when we are physically isolated from people, there's anxiety that naturally emerges, but we are charged to we in reality are not alone, that that the presence of the divine is an all-encompassing presence, and that safety and security and comfort still exists. There's one level of safety and security and comfort that exists when people are physically present, but the absence of people not being physically present does not remove all sources of comfort and safety and security. On the contrary, there are different ways that a person is supposed to think about times in their life were alone, and yet set the tunnel where they were aided or supported, they were blessed with openings, you know, times when they're on the subway and they're by themselves and they feared for their safety, and yet they got home safe, you know, times in different where they actually were alone, and they made it through that situation just fine. So we are invited to think about multiple cases in our life where we were alone or isolated, and to know that God was there for us then and still there for us Now, in those moments where people have no other choice, we're invited to think like that. I just thought I would share that.
Thank you so much, Imam Khalil. I realize we have about 5 minutes, so maybe for Reverend
Can I
Jill
just
and
add to that just a little
Yeah,
bit? I mean, because
absolutely.
it's a little less, I mean, it's a similar response, but a little less theistic. My mother died alone in the hospital, and what brought me great comfort is after reading Final Gifts, which is written by hospice nurses, where people who die often envision someone to carry them, journey with them across the threshold into this mystery, and they've witnessed that happening. And also more from a Buddhist perspective, that this understanding that death is with us all the time as a compassionate companion, like always present. And that, so in a way, that presence, you know, that Cahill was talking about was there. It's just a different lens on what that presence might be.
Thank you so much. And Rabbi Mike, maybe you can answer the question and also wrap it up for us, since we're very close to the time as well.
Well, I'll let you decide if there's a we'll wrap it. Anyway, I'll just say that first of all, you know what Sarah is saying, and Reverend, what you said. These are just there's just such an ache here. There's just such a sadness here. Again, that this is happening around us. Sometimes it's happening for the people that we love, people that we can't visit. Whether they're suffering or not, if they're dying, it's just even more heightened. And so, like I would say to the child, we said about the child before, just to hold each other in that suffering, and to say that that's a profound expression of the soul given us to by God, that this is a painful time, and that we shouldn't run away from that pain, that we should express the pain. And I will also go back to the Mida Keneged Mida, that the measure for measure, that we have created a society of somewhat of isolation and of separating ourselves from people. We have solitary confinement as a punishment in this country, which is really barbaric, and we've done it to children. It's please God, we should come out of this, to know that this idea that we can separate some people as different or less than or other from us is foolishness, when this virus teaches us how interconnected we are. And we, like the Imam and the Reverend said, look, the Jews, we're talking about exile, really, right? The Jews know about exile. We've been through experiences like this in which there's cataclysm, and somehow there are spiritual reserves. There's something about the human spirit, the soul, some of us would call it, the little tiny bit of the infinite that God's implanted within us, that allows us to keep going. And the things that we're hearing from medical professionals, from people who are suffering, and this pressed downness on the chest, this disease does this to people, and yet they keep going. That in the midst of exile from each other, from ourselves, a reminder that even though the physical is suffering, that the laws of spirit are different from the laws of physics, and that even when we're alone, sometimes there's a spirit that guides and sustains us. That is impossible to describe and miraculous. And so we're really being asked to call on that spirit right now, on that power. Here's to resilience, Jen says. Amen. Here's to the infinite spirit that lives in us, even in the midst of exile and in the midst of suffering. And we're reaching out to each other in this moment, and that already is powerful. I've never met the Imam. Reverend Jill and I know each other a little bit, and this beautiful community is happening here.
It's very nourishing. I'm so grateful.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful indeed, and very beautiful. Thank you, Hussam, and everybody else for
you.
organizing this. This is beautiful.
Thank you so much for everybody for attending. I personally really enjoyed it, and I feel like I made new friends, both virtual and otherwise. I do hope that we continue the conversations as communities, and I have here on the slides emails and websites. If you have any other questions or ideas for future engagement, reach out. And Reverend Jill, Rabbi Mike, and Imam Khalil, really appreciate your time. And we'll be in touch so that we can see how we can further help our communities and further try to get closer to God together. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
In my prayers.
Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You
Yeah.
too, Jill.